What's one moment that made you go, that's it, I'm done?
He stood in the doorway, dripping with sweat, cheeks flushed like he'd run a marathon, though I knew damn well he hadn't broken a sweat for anyone but himself in years. His shirt was half untucked, one arm hanging onto a cheap convenience store bag with a Gatorade and some gas station beef jerky poking out the top. And then he said it, smooth as melted butter and just as greasy. Some idiot slammed into your car while it was parked. Hit and run. Real shame. I already called it in. Now, I've lived with this man for over 20 years. That's a long time to learn the tone of someone's voice when they're lying. And Tom? He didn't just lie, he performed his lies. Like a third-rate actor in a small-town play who knows the audience has seen his tricks 1,000 times before, but still thinks he can dazzle them with the same old act. I watched him carefully, taking in the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine, the twitch in his jaw, the sudden burst of affection as he leaned in to kiss my forehead, as if a gentle touch might erase the mess behind him. But I didn't lean away. I didn't question him. I didn't even react. Because that's what he expected from me. He thought I'd do what I always did, swallow the anger, smooth over the mess, make peace in a war I never started. When I finally stepped outside and saw the wreckage of what used to be my car, my old blue Honda Civic that I'd driven to work, to church, to pick up his prescriptions, and even once to bail his sorry ass out of a DUI, I felt something inside me shift. The front bumper was caved in, the headlights shattered like brittle eggshells, the passenger side looked like someone had tried to carve it open with a can opener. It wasn't just an accident, it was a beating. This wasn't a tap and run like he described. It looked like someone had backed into a brick wall, twice. And the funny thing was, there was no debris, no skid marks, no sign that another car had ever been involved. Just mine. Just his guilt, written all over twisted metal. He hovered behind me like a salesman watching a customer read the fine print, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, probably gripping that little vape pen he thought I didn't know about. He started to ramble, something about how people are careless, how the neighborhood's going downhill, how we should get cameras. That's when I knew. I knew it wasn't just an accident. It was something more. And he was trying to smother it under a blanket of noise. But I didn't say anything. I nodded, made a sound of agreement, and even muttered something about calling the insurance company on Monday. And the moment he turned and walked back inside to collapse on the couch and lose himself in one of those trashy renovation shows he loved so much, I went straight to the hallway closet and pulled out the small gray box I hadn't touched in 3 years. The GPS tracker. See, Tom had a habit of losing things. Phones, wallets, once even his entire set of tools, which I later found in the trunk of his truck under a pile of beer cans and receipts. So a few years back, after his third "where was I even" late night out with no explanation, I bought 2 GPS trackers and slipped one under the frame of my own car, mostly out of frustration, partly out of fear. I figured if he ever disappeared on me, I'd at least have a trail to follow. And yes, I'd told him. At least, I told him when I first set them up. But like everything else that didn't serve his ego, he forgot. Or chose to forget. I logged into the account on my old laptop, the one I kept in the bedroom, the one he never touched because he said the keyboard was too small and the screen gave him eye strain. It took a minute to load. Hell, the thing hadn't been updated in ages, but once I was in, the data hit me like a punch to the chest. At 7:42 p.m., Tom had been on the west side of town, near the train depot. At 8:15, he was parked behind a bar off Route 17 for exactly 24 minutes. Then, at 8:50, he drove to a residential neighborhood I didn't recognize, stayed there for another 20 minutes, and finally, at 9:31, he hit 70 miles per hour on a back road that led straight into the industrial zone. At 9:45, he stopped moving. That's when the car was wrecked. The logs showed no other cars around. Just him. No hit and run. No mystery driver. Just Tom alone, tearing through the night like a teenager on a joyride. And that was the moment I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Not anger. Not sadness. Clarity. Like a pane of dirty glass had finally been wiped clean. He thought I'd stay quiet. He thought I'd be too tired, too worn down, too dependent to push back. And maybe I had been. Maybe I'd let myself believe that staying kept things simple. That as long as I played dumb, I could avoid the mess. But now? Now I had proof. Real, undeniable, time-stamped truth. What I didn't have was a plan. Not yet. But I wasn't going to waste this moment. I wasn't going to let the truth rot in a folder on my laptop. I wanted to know why he was in that neighborhood. Who lived there? What he was doing behind that bar. And if the look in his eyes when he came home said anything, it was that he didn't expect me to look. He didn't think I had the guts. But I did. And I was done staying silent. Because here's the truth, silence isn't peace, it's paralysis. And for the first time in years, I was ready to move. I was ready to dig. I didn't want revenge, not yet. I just wanted the whole story. Because the truth has a funny way of slipping through the cracks. You just have to know where to look. And I had all the time in the world to look. It's strange how silence becomes a habit, how you can live in a house full of noise, TV always on, phone buzzing on the counter, the sound of a man's voice spinning stories over dinner, and still feel like you're buried under a thick, invisible blanket of quiet. For years, I let that silence keep me comfortable, told myself it was easier to look away than to face what might be staring right at me. But that night, sitting in my bedroom with my old laptop humming on the comforter, staring at the GPS trail of my husband's evening escapade, something cracked open. And once you hear that first snap, the quiet fracture in the story you've been telling yourself, it's only a matter of time before the whole damn thing splits in two. I stared at the logs until my eyes ached, zooming in and out of the map, retracing every mile he drove, every stop he made, trying to understand not just where he'd been but why. The pattern wasn't random, that much was clear. He'd made 3 stops, the industrial backroad where the car was wrecked, the bar off Route 17, and most curious of all, a quiet residential street in a neighborhood neither of us had ever mentioned in all our years of living in this town. It wasn't near his job sites. It wasn't near any of our friends. And it certainly wasn't near anything that justified him being there for 20 minutes just before he slammed my car into a concrete loading dock like a drunk teenager who mistook rage for a steering wheel. I didn't ask him about it. Not yet. That kind of confrontation, the direct, unfiltered kind, used to be my go-to move back when I still believed we were partners, back when I thought maybe all he needed was the benefit of the doubt and a calm conversation. But I learned, slowly and painfully, that men like Tom don't crumble when you confront them. They deflect. They twist. They make you question whether the thing you saw was ever real. You must have misheard. That's not what happened. You're overthinking again. And before you know it, you're apologizing for even bringing it up, making tea in the kitchen while he watches reruns and mutters about how sensitive women are these days. So instead of speaking, I started really remembering, how many times I'd let him get away with stories that didn't quite add up. There was the time, 7 years ago, when he said he got rear-ended in the parking lot of a grocery store 2 towns over, but the dent in the bumper looked like it came from hitting a pole. The insurance claim came through, and I let it go. Then there was the woman at his old job who used to call our house at 10 o'clock at night, by accident, saying she meant to reach his office line. Her name was just Maggie from HR, but when I asked what HR had to do with late-night phone calls, he looked me dead in the eye and told me I was imagining things. And I believed him. Or maybe I just wanted to. The truth is, I'd been collecting pieces for a long time, even when I didn't realize it, bits of strange receipts I found in his pockets, credit card charges from cities he said he never visited, and little changes in his behavior that, by themselves, didn't mean much. But together, they painted a picture of a man who never really left his bachelor years behind, who treated marriage like a timeshare, something you commit to just enough to enjoy the benefits without ever truly investing in it. And now, with the GPS logs laid out before me like a roadmap to betrayal, I knew the silence had reached its expiration date. Still, before I made any accusations, I needed more. I wanted to know who lived at that mystery address, wanted to see with my own eyes whether he'd been lying to me again, or if this was just another meaningless detour in a life full of them. I wrote the address down in the back of my grocery list notebook, the one I always kept in my purse, then tucked the laptop away, and went to bed beside the man who, just hours earlier, had stood in my doorway and fed me a story with that same old grin. Like I was still the woman who would take it without question. He was already snoring when I slid under the covers, his body turned away from me, one leg kicked out like he owned the entire bed. I laid there in the dark, not touching him, not speaking, just listening to the rhythm of his breathing, wondering how many nights I'd spent like this, lying awake beside a man who had no idea how far I'd drifted from him. The next morning, I poured his coffee the way I always did: 2 sugars, 1 cream, a dash of cinnamon on top, because he once read in a magazine that cinnamon boosts testosterone and clung to the idea like it was gospel. He barely looked up from his phone, muttering something about a plumbing job he had to check on out in town. I smiled, nodded, and told him to be safe, pretending not to notice how his phone lit up with a message from a number labeled Mike W., a man I'd met exactly once at a Christmas party 5 years ago and hadn't heard of since. I made a mental note to check the logs again that evening. Before he left, he kissed me on the cheek like nothing was wrong, like I hadn't spent the entire night gathering evidence against him in the shadows. And as I closed the door behind him and locked it, I realized something I hadn't let myself believe in a long time. This wasn't about one lie, or one wrecked car, or one bar visit on a Thursday night. This was about a pattern. A system. A structure built on small betrayals that, brick by brick, had created the prison I'd been living in without even realizing the walls had gone up around me. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to tear the damn thing down. Later that afternoon, I typed the mystery address into Google Maps, half expecting it to be a random house or an empty lot. But it wasn't. It was a neat little split level on Wisteria Drive, a quiet cul-de-sac in a middle-class neighborhood on the other side of town. The name on the property record made my breath catch: Lisa Hendricks. A name I hadn't thought about in years, but still rang like a bell in my memory. Lisa, his old girlfriend from his lost years, the one he swore was a mistake, a fling, a chapter long closed. So he was seeing her again. Or at least visiting. Which meant this lie was bigger than a smashed car. It was about a woman. A history. And a present he'd built without ever thinking I'd find my way to the truth. But I had found it. Or at least the edge of it. And now? Now I wanted the rest. And I wasn't going to stop until I had it all. The sun had barely risen when I pulled out of our driveway that Saturday morning, the sky still clinging to the deep indigo of dawn, and the streets lying quiet under a light sheen of mist that made everything feel a little surreal, as though I were navigating a dreamscape rather than the town I'd lived in for over 2 decades. I didn't tell Tom where I was going, didn't leave a note or invent a story about running errands or seeing an old friend, because I knew he wouldn't notice I was gone until lunch, maybe later, and even then, he'd assume I was out grocery shopping or dropping off a donation at the church like I sometimes did on the weekends when the house felt too full of his voice and not enough of mine. In his mind, I was always orbiting around him, a satellite circling the same predictable path, never veering too far, never burning up on reentry. But today, that orbit broke. I followed the address from the GPS logs to the far side of town, past the familiar strip malls and diners, out toward a quieter neighborhood that seemed to have aged better than ours: fewer cracked sidewalks, newer mailboxes, cars that still gleamed in the driveways instead of gathering dust and disappointment. Wisteria Drive, it was called, which sounded more like a desperate attempt to make something sound quaint than anything based in reality. And yet, as I pulled onto the street, there was something unsettlingly charming about the place: the neat hedges, the matching porch lights, the way every window looked like it had just been cleaned by a woman who still believed in polishing glass to perfection. Not because anyone was watching, but because it made her feel like she was holding something together. I parked 2 houses down from the one listed in the records, number 18, and killed the engine, suddenly unsure of what I'd planned to do. Confront her? Pretend I was someone else and ask if she needed help with a package? Or just sit here like a lunatic and watch until something gave me a reason to believe the story I feared was true? I didn't know. I just knew I had to see her with my own eyes, had to make this real in a way screenshots and addresses and hunches could never do. The front door of number 18 opened after only 10 minutes of my quiet vigil, and out stepped a woman who, even from a distance, I could tell had history with my husband. Her walk was too confident, her movements too relaxed, and though she was older than the last time I'd seen her, her hair a little shorter, her body carrying the years like soft armor instead of vanity, there was no mistaking her. Lisa Hendricks. She didn't see me, of course. She walked to her mailbox, retrieved a few letters, glanced up and down the street without much interest, then turned and disappeared back inside, the door clicking shut behind her like the last page of a book I hadn't finished reading. I could have driven away then, let it go, told myself that maybe Tom had stopped by to drop something off, to help with a leaky sink or carry in a box of books, something innocent and benign. And maybe that's what he would have said if I'd asked. But my gut, my worn-down, hardened gut, the one that had been wrong more times than it should have been and still hadn't learned to stop speaking, told me different. And the next time Tom left the house claiming to be headed to a supply store, I followed him. I stayed back, kept my distance, drove slow with the windows cracked and the radio off, every nerve in my body buzzing like I'd swallowed a live wire. He didn't even look around. Didn't check his mirrors. Didn't act like a man with something to hide, because in his mind, there was nothing to hide, not from me at least. I was harmless, predictable, safe, and that was his first mistake. He pulled into Lisa's driveway at 2:13 in the afternoon, got out of his truck without hesitation, walked up the steps like he'd done it a dozen times, maybe more, and rang the bell. She opened the door with a smile, an actual, honest-to-God smile, and let him in without a word. No hug, no kiss. Just a familiarity that made me feel like the stranger in the story. I didn't follow him in. I didn't barge through the door and scream his name. That might have been my instinct once, years ago, back when I still reacted before thinking, back when I believed yelling could fix things or at least make them shift. No, I waited. 40 minutes. 50. An hour. Long enough to know it wasn't about a leaky faucet or moving boxes. And when he finally came out, he looked light, relaxed, like someone who'd just been reminded that life could still feel good. I didn't need to know the details. I didn't need a confession or a confrontation or a moment of honesty that would never come. I just needed to see it, to know what I already knew. And that was when the second shift happened, the one deeper than the first, the one that didn't just crack my silence, it shattered my restraint. I started moving money that night. Slowly. Carefully. Not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to matter. I had access to our accounts, joint checking, savings, the side fund he'd forgotten I helped set up back when he was still trying to impress me with talk of early retirement and vacation homes. I opened a separate account in my name and transferred small amounts every few days, just a few hundred here and there, always with a purpose he couldn't argue with. I paid the insurance, I covered the vet bill, I sent money to Ellie for her textbooks. Lies, yes, but not the kind that burned bridges. Just the kind that laid the groundwork. I changed passwords too. Not the ones he used, but the ones I did. Email, phone plan, credit monitoring. I reestablished the digital borders of my life, separate, quiet, protected. I called a lawyer. Not to file anything. Not yet. Just to ask questions. To gather facts. To prepare. And, through it all, I smiled. I cooked. I laughed at his jokes when I had to. I let him think he was still in control. Because sometimes the most satisfying kind of revenge isn't explosive or loud, it's slow, deliberate, surgical. Like draining poison from a wound one drop at a time. But the part that really caught me off guard, the part ones still don't fully understand, came late one night when I was scrolling through my messages and found one from a number I didn't recognize. No greeting. No signature. Just 7 words. You deserve better than this. Keep going. At first, I thought it might have been a scam, some throwaway message meant to bait me into replying. But something about the timing, the tone, it felt intentional. Like someone was watching. Like someone knew. And that was when I realized I wasn't alone. Not anymore. Because somewhere out there, someone else had seen the same cracks I had. And they wanted me to keep digging. So I did. There's a particular kind of madness that creeps in when you're pretending everything is fine while knowing, deep in your gut and down to your bones, that it absolutely is not. It doesn't arrive like a storm or crash in through the window like some chaotic force of destruction. It seeps in slowly, like water beneath a door frame, quiet and patient. Unnoticed until you step in it one morning and realize the foundation's been rotting for years. That was the feeling I woke up with each day after I watched Tom walk into Lisa's house, like it was just another errand, like she was just another stop on his route. The ache wasn't just in my heart, it had settled into my joints, into the way I folded laundry, into the way I stirred his coffee, into the way I smiled when he told me, yet again, that he was heading out to check on a buddy's remodel. He'd grown comfortable in his lies, so comfortable, in fact, that they no longer required creativity or effort. They came out rehearsed, routine, draped in the kind of casual confidence that only a man who'd never faced consequences could maintain. That smug assurance he wore like an old coat, frayed but reliable, was what pushed me over the edge, not the affair itself. Not the wrecked car, not even the money he quietly drained from our savings over the years without bothering to explain. No, it was the look on his face when he lied. That look said he didn't just believe I'd stay quiet, he believed I'd never be clever enough to catch him in a way that would matter. So I decided to make it matter. I waited a full week before putting anything in motion, a week of perfect domestic rhythm where I kissed him goodbye at the door, texted him friendly reminders about dinner, and even threw in a compliment or two about how great he'd been looking lately. Though the truth was, he looked like a man falling apart slowly from the inside, wearing cologne to cover guilt and blaming his indigestion on cheap beer instead of the slow erosion of his conscience. During that week, I made a few subtle purchases. A discreet camera small enough to fit behind a stack of paint cans in the garage, an audio recorder I could slip into the kitchen drawer without notice, and a motion sensor light he'd believe I installed for security, not because I wanted to know exactly when he came and went. He had no reason to suspect a thing. He'd grown so used to my silence that he'd mistaken it for stupidity, and that was the most delicious part, how certain he was that I'd never shift the power, never think to do more than pout and mumble under my breath. He didn't know that while he was at Lisa's, I was at home engineering a trap so subtle, so completely embedded in his daily life, that he wouldn't even notice it closing around him until it was far too late. And the bait? That was the easiest part. I told him I was going out of town for a weekend, just a quick girls' trip to Charleston with women he barely remembered from our church group, women I hadn't spoken to in years, but whose names still rolled easily off my tongue because I knew he wouldn't fact-check me, wouldn't care enough to ask follow-up questions. He nodded, gave me that distracted "have fun, babe," while scrolling through his phone, and went back to whatever nonsense he was watching on YouTube. I could have told him I was flying to the moon, and he would have shrugged and asked if I could pick up more beer on the way home. When Friday arrived, I packed a small overnight bag, drove 2 towns over, and checked into a cheap motel off the interstate, where I sat with my laptop connected to the garage camera's feed, watching the familiar static of home while the minutes ticked by. I didn't have to wait long. By 7:30, the garage sensor pinged, and less than 5 minutes later, the camera caught him pulling up with someone in the passenger seat. It was dark, but the outline was unmistakable. Lisa, stepping out in heels too tall for someone who was supposedly just helping Tom organize the garage. They laughed. They touched. They walked into my home, the one I cleaned every damn week and filled with framed pictures of holidays and birthdays and barbecues that now looked more like crime scenes than memories. And the worst part wasn't the betrayal, it was the ease. The routine. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a habit, a ritual, something rehearsed enough that they didn't even hesitate to walk through my front door like they belonged there. I recorded everything, every movement, every sound, every quiet laugh as they moved through the house. I didn't need graphic footage or salacious detail. I needed presence. Proof. The unshakable kind. The kind you can't talk your way out of with charm or excuses or some half-assed explanation about how you weren't thinking straight. And once I had it, once the files were saved in 3 separate cloud accounts, 1 flash drive, and my phone, I didn't feel angry. I felt calm. Because now I had control. I had the upper hand. And I wasn't going to waste it on a screaming match in the kitchen. Instead, I called Lisa. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I didn't even flinch when her voice wavered at the sound of my name. I told her I wanted to talk woman to woman. That I wasn't interested in drama or vengeance or some Lifetime movie showdown. I just wanted to ask a few questions. She hesitated, of course. Said she didn't think it was appropriate. But then I mentioned the camera. The footage. The undeniable truth. And she changed her tune. We met at a small wine bar downtown, the kind of place with dim lighting and overpriced cheese boards that make people feel like their secrets are safer in the dark. She wore too much perfume and looked older than I remembered, but not unkind. Just tired. And when I slid the phone across the table and played the clip, just a short one, just enough to confirm the details, she didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't storm out. She whispered, "He told me you were separated. That you'd left him. That he was fixing up the house alone." And in that moment, something unspoken passed between us. A quiet recognition. A shared truth that we had both been lied to, used, placed on opposite ends of a scale he'd never planned to balance. I could have hated her. I could have lashed out. But I didn't. Because I saw what I needed in her face, not just guilt, but shock. She hadn't known. By the end of the night, we weren't friends. We weren't allies. But we were no longer strangers pulled apart by his web of lies. And as I drove home, back to the house where he thought he still held all the cards, I smiled, not out of happiness or satisfaction, but because I finally understood what real power looked like. It looked like truth. And Tom? He was about to see it, face to face. There's something strangely ceremonial about preparing for a confrontation when you already know you've won, not in the petty, gloating way that people imagine revenge should feel, but in the deliberate, measured silence that comes when the emotional chaos has burned itself out and left behind nothing but the cold, clear ashes of finality. It's not rage anymore, and it's not heartbreak either, not really. It's something else entirely. An eerie calm that wraps around your shoulders like a heavy coat, anchoring every step, slowing every breath, and reminding you, with relentless precision, that the performance is over and the curtains are about to come down. And as I set the dining room table that evening with his favorite placemats, the good cutlery, and the wine glasses we hadn't used since our 20th anniversary, I knew Tom didn't have the faintest idea that the show was about to end, not with a scream. Not with a slap, but with a quiet unraveling he wouldn't see coming until it was far too late to stop it. He walked in just past 6, predictably late and smelling faintly of engine grease and that same cheap cologne he thought made him smell expensive, tossing his keys onto the side table like a man who believed everything he touched would stay exactly where he left it. When he saw the table, he blinked, just once, that small pause his mind always took when something didn't quite fit his expectations, and then offered a lopsided grin that used to charm me before I realized it was just a habit, not a feeling. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing toward the roast, the potatoes, the candles flickering gently beside the bowl of salad he'd never eat but would compliment out of ritual. "Anniversary," he guessed with a chuckle, or did I die and nobody told me? I smiled, not a real one, but the kind that stretches your lips into a shape people don't question, the kind that keeps the mask in place just long enough to get through the next few minutes. "Nope," I said, my voice as smooth as the Cabernet I poured into his glass. "Just thought it was time we talked." Really talked. He didn't like that. Not right away. That word, talk, set off something behind his eyes, something flickering and suspicious, because men like Tom don't do talking unless they're steering the conversation or trying to smooth over some disaster with a joke and a compliment. But he sat down anyway, the fork in his hand trembling just slightly as he stabbed a piece of meat and shoved it into his mouth like eating would buy him time. I let him chew in silence, let the weight of the moment settle over the table like dust on forgotten furniture, and then, with no drama, no warning, no raised voice or slamming fist, I slid the manila folder across the table and watched as his expression shifted from amusement to confusion to a slow, dawning horror. Inside the folder were the printouts, pages of GPS logs, each marked with times, dates, locations, some highlighted for emphasis, others underlined in red pen I hadn't used since our daughter was in elementary school. Beneath those were photographs, low-resolution stills from the garage camera, time-stamped and undeniable, followed by the transcript of the audio I'd captured, the one where he laughed and said something about how Heather still thinks I'm working late, while Lisa giggled in the background and told him he was a terrible liar. And yet, even with all that in front of him, even with the mountain of evidence laid out like a crime scene report, he still tried. That was the part that stunned me, not the betrayal, not the depth of his deception, but the way he instinctively reached for denial like it was a reflex he couldn't suppress. This isn't what it looks like, he said, his voice suddenly hoarse, his fingers twitching at the edges of the folder as if he could reshuffle the contents and reorder reality. I mean, yeah, I stopped by Lisa's a few times, but it wasn't like that. She was going through some stuff, and you, Heather, you've been so distant lately, and… I cut him off with a look, not harsh, not angry, just finished. Tom, I said quietly, my voice flat as a dry lake bed, don't insult me by pretending you haven't been cheating. Don't waste what little dignity you have left on a lie that bad. He fell silent then, not because he believed me, but because, for the first time in our marriage, I didn't leave room for negotiation. There was no bargaining, no appeal, no soft place to land. Just the truth, cold and final, sitting between us like a third presence at the table. Then I handed him the final envelope, the legal one. Divorce papers signed and dated. I didn't toss them or slam them down or do anything cinematic. I just placed them gently beside his wine glass like a dinner bill, like the price of the meal we both knew was our last. And then, for the first time all night, he looked genuinely afraid. Because inside that envelope, along with the papers, was a single business card, my lawyer's, a woman who didn't smile much but asked all the right questions. And stapled to the back of the card was a copy of the complaint I had already submitted to the IRS tip line, complete with itemized claims from his fraudulent business expenses, the ones he bragged about at barbecues, laughing about how he could write off anything if you're slick enough. You can keep the truck, I told him as I stood and took my plate to the sink, and the tools. And whatever's left of your dignity, if you can find it. He didn't speak. Just stared, mouth slightly open, eyes blank like someone who'd seen a ghost, but didn't believe in the afterlife. I walked past him, up the stairs, and closed the bedroom door behind me. I didn't cry. I didn't even shake. I just sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, letting the silence settle not as a burden, but as a relief. It was finally over. The noise, the lies, the weight of pretending. But as I reached for my phone to check the time, it buzzed again, another message from the same unknown number. One line, simple and clean. So, you still want to burn his life down together? I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't know how to respond, but because I finally had the luxury of choosing not to. Whoever they were, Lisa, maybe, or someone else who'd seen Tom for who he truly was, they weren't wrong. But maybe it wasn't about burning anything anymore. Maybe it was just about stepping into a life I didn't have to explain or justify or protect anymore. Still, I didn't delete the message. Because even when the war ends, you don't throw away your armor. You hang it up, quietly, just in case.